In early 2022, authorities in Arizona made a discovery so horrifying that it sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. Hidden within the walls of a quiet suburban home lay the remains of a 13-year-old boy, a victim of unimaginable neglect and abuse. This tragic case would soon unravel into a story of systemic failures, missed opportunities, and the dark realities of child abuse. It all began with an anonymous tip. A concerned neighbor had reported strange odors emanating from the home of the Peterson family, a seemingly normal household in the outskirts of Phoenix. The family, consisting of parents Linda and Mark Peterson, along with their 3 children, had always maintained a low profile. They were rarely seen interacting with others, and their children were often absent from local schools. When authorities arrived to conduct a welfare check, they were met with resistance. The parents were hesitant, reluctant to let law enforcement into their home. But the persistence of the officers paid off, and after obtaining a search warrant, they entered the residence. What they found was beyond comprehension. Inside, the house was in a state of extreme disarray. The floors were covered in filth, trash piled in corners, and a stench so overpowering that officers had to wear protective gear. But the most harrowing discovery came when they removed a section of the drywall in one of the bedrooms. There, wrapped in old blankets and plastic, were the skeletal remains of a child. The victim was later identified as 13-year-old Daniel Peterson, the couple's eldest son. The revelation sent investigators on a deep dive into the Peterson family's past. How had a child gone missing for so long without anyone noticing? Why had no one reported his absence? As authorities pieced together the grim details, they uncovered a horrifying pattern of neglect, manipulation, and a community that had failed to protect one of its most vulnerable members. The discovery of 13-year-old Daniel Peterson's remains sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had once dismissed the Peterson family as merely private now found themselves questioning how they had missed the signs. The media descended upon the quiet Arizona neighborhood, turning the tragic case into a nationwide discussion about child abuse, neglect, and systemic failure. As investigators dug deeper into Daniel's past, a disturbing narrative began to emerge. One that painted a picture of years of silent suffering, missed warning signs, and a system that had failed to intervene in time. The investigation began with the autopsy confirming what authorities had feared. Daniel had been dead for at least a year before his remains were discovered. His body bore signs of prolonged malnutrition and physical abuse. Bruises, fractures that had healed improperly, and evidence of untreated injuries suggested a long history of suffering. The medical examiner ruled his death a homicide. Police turned their attention to Linda and Mark Peterson. The couple, now in custody, refused to speak to authorities, invoking their right to remain silent. But the evidence spoke volumes. Investigators uncovered a history of reports made to Child Protective Services, CPS, each detailing concerns about the Peterson children. These reports spanned over 5 years, yet no significant action had been taken. Records revealed that Daniel had been withdrawn from school nearly 2 years before his death. His parents had informed the district that he would be homeschooled, a claim that, under Arizona law, required minimal oversight. No follow-ups were conducted to ensure his education or well-being. Further investigation uncovered a string of red flags. A former teacher had reported Daniel's frequent absences and concerning weight loss before he was removed from school. A pediatrician had raised concerns about signs of malnutrition and bruising, yet the case had been closed due to lack of evidence. A neighbor recalled hearing muffled cries late at night, but had convinced themselves it was their imagination. With each piece of evidence, it became clear that Daniel had not simply slipped through the cracks, he had been ignored by a system that was supposed to protect him. Under public scrutiny, Arizona's CPS came under fire. Reports indicated that caseworkers had visited the Peterson home on multiple occasions, only to be turned away or provided with just enough cooperation to close the cases. The agency was understaffed, overburdened, and plagued by bureaucratic inefficiencies that allowed at-risk children like Daniel to remain in dangerous environments. CPS officials released a statement expressing their condolences and vowing to review internal protocols. But for many, the damage was already done. Advocacy groups called for immediate reforms, demanding stricter oversight on homeschooling, more thorough follow-ups on reported abuse, and increased accountability for agencies responsible for child welfare. The Petersons' neighborhood became a focal point for mourning and outrage. A memorial of flowers, candles, and stuffed animals grew outside the family's former residence. Neighbors grappled with their own feelings of guilt. "I should have said something sooner," admitted one resident. "I heard things. I saw things. But I told myself it wasn't my business." The case also sparked debates about the responsibility of communities in preventing child abuse. Experts emphasized the importance of reporting suspicions, even when there's uncertainty. "We have a duty to be the voice for children who can't speak for themselves," said Dr. Karen Phillips, a leading child welfare advocate. Silence can be deadly. With their parents in custody, the Petersons' remaining children, a 10-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy, were placed into protective care. Psychologists working with them revealed disturbing details about their upbringing. The siblings spoke of strict punishments, food deprivation, and long periods of isolation. The 10-year-old girl in particular became a key witness. She told investigators that Daniel had been locked in a closet for days at a time. As he grew weaker, his parents withheld food, calling it discipline. When he eventually died, they panicked and hid his body in the walls. Her testimony painted a grim picture of life inside the Peterson household, a house of horror disguised as a home. Linda and Mark Peterson were formally charged with multiple offenses, including first-degree murder, child abuse, and concealment of a body. Prosecutors vowed to seek the maximum penalty, arguing that their actions were premeditated and inexcusable. As the trial loomed, the case reignited national conversations about child abuse prevention. Lawmakers in Arizona introduced new legislation aimed at increasing oversight of homeschooling and strengthening CPS intervention protocols. Advocacy groups pushed for Daniel's Law, a bill designed to enforce stricter penalties for child endangerment and mandate regular wellness checks for at-risk children. But for many, no legal reform could undo the horror of what had happened to Daniel. His story became a haunting reminder of the dangers of silence in the face of abuse. As the trial date approached, Daniel's name continued to make headlines. His former classmates and teachers held a candlelight vigil, vowing to keep his memory alive. "He deserved so much better," one former teacher said through tears. "I just hope his story saves another child." Though the wheels of justice were now turning, the deep scars left by Daniel's death would never fully heal. His life, stolen far too soon, became a tragic symbol of a system in desperate need of change. The world watched as his parents faced judgment. But the true challenge remained, ensuring that no other child suffered the same fate. For Daniel, it was too late. But for countless others, there was still hope. If only the world was willing to listen. As the trial of Linda and Mark Peterson began, the courtroom was packed with journalists, child welfare advocates, and members of the community who had been deeply affected by the tragic death of Daniel Peterson. The prosecution laid out the horrifying details of Daniel's abuse, presenting evidence collected from the home, testimony from medical experts, and the heartbreaking accounts of his surviving siblings. The star witness for the prosecution was Daniel's 10-year-old sister, Emily Peterson. Sitting in the witness stand, she recounted the torment her older brother had endured. She spoke in a trembling voice, describing how Daniel had been locked away for days, sometimes weeks, in a tiny closet with barely any food or water. She recalled the way he had cried out for help, only to be met with cruel punishments from their parents. She told the jury about the final days of Daniel's life, how he had grown too weak to move, how his voice had faded into silence, and how, when he finally passed, their parents had hidden his body in the walls and forced the family to pretend as though he had never existed. The defense, in a desperate attempt to shift blame, argued that Linda and Mark had suffered from severe mental illness and were unfit to stand trial. Their attorneys claimed that years of financial struggles and personal hardships had driven them to irrational behavior. They insisted that while their actions were horrific, they had not been premeditated. The jury, however, was unmoved by these claims. The evidence was overwhelming, and the testimonies of witnesses painted a clear picture of prolonged and deliberate cruelty. Medical experts took the stand to further illustrate the extent of Daniel's suffering. The autopsy report was read aloud, detailing the severe malnutrition, untreated broken bones, and internal injuries that had plagued the young boy in the months leading up to his death. The prosecution played recorded interviews from neighbors, teachers, and doctors, each revealing the many warning signs that had gone unnoticed or ignored. The courtroom was silent as each painful truth was laid bare. The case was not just about Linda and Mark Peterson. It was about the failures of an entire system. Child Protective Services workers were called to testify, forced to answer difficult questions about why multiple reports of neglect had been dismissed. Lawmakers and advocacy groups argued that Daniel's death was preventable, and that systemic reforms were necessary to ensure that no other child suffered the same fate. The trial had become more than just a legal proceeding. It was a wake-up call to a nation grappling with the realities of child abuse and institutional neglect. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict. Linda and Mark Peterson were found guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder, child abuse, and concealing a body. The judge, recognizing the brutality of their crimes, sentenced them both to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The ruling was met with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but it could never bring Daniel back. In the wake of the trial, lawmakers in Arizona passed Daniel's Law, a series of reforms aimed at improving child welfare services. The new legislation mandated stricter oversight of homeschooling, increased the frequency of wellness checks for at-risk children, and implemented harsher penalties for individuals who failed to report suspected abuse. The law was seen as a step in the right direction, though many believed there was still much work to be done. Emily and her younger brother Nathan were placed in a foster home where they began the slow process of healing. Therapists and child welfare specialists worked closely with them to help them cope with the trauma they had endured. The children, once prisoners in their own home, were now given the chance to rebuild their lives in safety. The memory of Daniel Peterson lived on in the hearts of those who had followed his tragic story. His name became a symbol of resilience and a reminder of the importance of vigilance when it comes to protecting vulnerable children. His former school established a scholarship in his name, dedicated to supporting students who had overcome adversity. Community members who had once turned a blind eye vowed to never ignore the signs of abuse again. As the years passed, the impact of Daniel's case continued to be felt. Child abuse prevention programs gained more support, and more people began speaking out against the culture of silence that allowed such horrors to persist. Though Daniel's life had been stolen from him, his story became a catalyst for change, ensuring that his suffering would not be in vain. For Emily and Nathan, the road to recovery was long and difficult, but they were no longer alone. Surrounded by people who truly cared for them, they learned to dream again, to smile again, and to hope for a future far different from the one they had once known. And as they grew older, they carried with them the memory of their brother, not as a tragic figure, but as a beacon of strength, whose story had made the world a better place. After weeks of testimony, the jury took only a few hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder and child abuse. The judge, in an uncharacteristically emotional statement, condemned Linda and Mark's actions as the epitome of evil. He sentenced them both to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that neither would ever be able to harm another child again. The sentencing brought a semblance of justice. But for many, the wounds left by Daniel's death would never fully heal. In the wake of the trial, calls for child welfare reform grew louder. Advocacy groups pushed for increased oversight of homeschooling, stricter penalties for unreported child abuse, and major reforms within Child Protective Services. Lawmakers introduced Daniel's Law, a bill aimed at ensuring that cases like his would never be overlooked again. The proposed law included mandatory wellness checks for children removed from public education, improved tracking of abuse allegations, and harsher penalties for caregivers who obstruct investigations. In the Petersons' neighborhood, the house where Daniel suffered so much became a painful reminder of the community's failure to act. After much debate, the property was demolished, replaced with a small memorial garden dedicated to victims of child abuse. The site became a place of reflection, where people could come to honor Daniel's memory and remind themselves of the responsibility they bore to protect the vulnerable. Meanwhile, Daniel's surviving siblings were placed in the care of a foster family, who vowed to provide them with the love and stability they had never known. Therapists worked closely with them to help them process the trauma they had endured. Though the road to healing was long, there was hope that they could rebuild their lives free from fear and suffering. The impact of Daniel's case extended far beyond his immediate community. His story served as a wake-up call to many, inspiring neighbors, teachers, and medical professionals to be more vigilant. Reports of suspected abuse surged in the months following the trial, a sign that people were no longer willing to turn a blind eye. In the end, Daniel became more than just a victim. He became a symbol of resilience, a catalyst for change, and a reminder that no cry for help should ever go unheard.